Yo guys, and welcome to the first real video on this channel. I hope you guys are doing fantastic. So this is the first video except for the introduction video that I posted previously. So if you haven't checked that out, feel free to do that if you want to get a better idea of what's to come. It's totally optional. You can just watch these videos anyways, and you will probably get a good idea of what we are gonna be doing anyways. So we're going to be creating our first application slash project, and that is a to-do application. So like I mentioned, this is probably the most vanilla thing ever. This is something that I think every single developer does sometime during their career in one form or another. And I think the reason for that is because we are not satisfied with any of the applications, to-do applications that we find. We are just not there. You simply don't meet our requirements. We all have our unique tastes and preferences, and we want these features combined with these features, and it kind of never get that perfect match. So why not take the matter into our own hands and actually create our own to-do application? And the framework that I'm going to be using is Svelte, and the reason for that is because, as I mentioned, it is also my personal preference, and I think to stay as productive as possible, we should also stay as comfortable as possible. And in my opinion, Svelte is the best framework for me. I think it suits all my needs. I think it is a great modern alternative to the mainstream ones like React and Vue and Angular and all of those. And I think it's kind of offers something else to the table, really. I think it's kind of a game changer, really, because the difference with Svelte is really that it is a compiled it's kind of a compiled language with its own syntax. So instead of relying on this, JSX and other kind of syntaxes, we have our own more clear syntax. I think it's a very intuitive syntax that makes a lot of sense. I think compared to React, for example, which uses JSX, you kind of get this, hacky feel. It feels like, sure, they tried their best, but it kind of feels they are just like conditional rendering. For example, you have double and signs for that, just because that is how you would do it in JavaScript. It kind of feels like a hacky way to do it. Really, it doesn't feel like the most intuitive way, and it kind of adds to a little bit of a steeper learning curve, really. So I think Svelte is really intuitive, and since we are doing productive development here, we're doing practical development here, I think it's a great, intuitive, easy to learn framework that is also more performant actually than these frameworks like React or Vue and similar, because it is compiled and actually doesn't use virtual DOM. So if you don't know about virtual DOM, I definitely recommend checking out a YouTube video or reading about it. I don't think I can explain it in as great terms as someone else can do, but it simply is that when we have virtual DOM, we have this kind of virtual representation of the DOM, and the DOM is the document object model. So that is what is being rendered on our screen, all of the elements on our screen. With a virtual DOM, we have another DOM, really, a replica of the DOM that we use when we are gonna compare it from different state changes. So when we change a variable, like a count variable, a number variable, for example, we have to change that. Then we get a new snapshot of this DOM in our virtual DOM, and then we compare these snapshots from each other. We see, yeah, it has changed, and we want to re-render it, and just then we apply it to the actual DOM on the site. But with Svelte, they have it more surgically, as they themselves explain it, that they have a lot more control over their elements since it is compiled language. So when a state changes, it is already compiled, kind of predefined in the code, that when this variable changes, then this inner text is gonna change, for example, an example like that. So we're gonna be installing that right now. And as you see, I am in VS Code. I also think it's a great software. It is very popular for very good reasons. It's lightweight. It is also cross-platform. So I'm on Linux right now, but I don't think it matters that much actually to this tutorial, because I will be explaining things as cross-platform as possible. So let's just open a terminal here. So if you don't have the Node.js environment installed already, you definitely have to install that right now. So you can check that by just running npm, and if you see a help index like this, then you know that you have successfully installed npm. So if you get like an error message, command doesn't exist or something like that, then you can just install it from their website. So just install a Node.js environment. If you have Windows, for example, I think it comes, so npm comes installed, as an option here, which you definitely want to select. And for other, like Mac OS, I'm not really sure, but for Linux, you might have to, consult the documentation and maybe check in your package manager if you can find Node.js. So yeah, make sure that Node.js is installed on your machine. So now that you got Node.js and npm installed, we're gonna be installing our first packages here. So we're gonna be using Vite, and if you haven't heard about it, it is next generation front-end tooling. So this is simply used for, kind of bundling your code really, and also providing a development server. So bundling simply means that we take all of this Svelte code, our JavaScript code, all of our HTML, all of our CSS, and then we just press it all together into 3 files really. So you have one HTML file and one JavaScript file and one CSS file. So all of this is just compiled really unbundled and then, minified as well. So we put everything on one single line, for example, and stuff like that to, keep space down. So the reason for that is really that we want to, reduce network bandwidth and save cost, but also make our site load a lot faster. And that is also, important if you're creating a business, for example, because there's loads of these interesting studies which say that something in the terms of like the faster load time you have, the more customers you will convert and stuff like that. So maybe there is something to it. Maybe it's just some weird study, but why not be as performant as possible? I think is a good rule to set for ourselves. So with Vite, we simply get this bundling. We get it very straightforward, and we also get presets. So we get a preset for Svelte, for example, which generates all the necessary files. We don't have to worry about any of that. Then we also get a development server, which is a great, it's a banger feature of this Vite. So it simply means that if we write changes to our code and then save them, they will be automatically reflected on our site. So we get a development server that reflects the changes in real time as we save the files. So that really boosts our productivity, and it makes us happier because we don't have to sit in command line and recompile and rebuild and handle all of that. So it's very, very productive and quick. So we're going to be using that to install the Svelte preset really. So we have these variants, and as usual, when it comes to JavaScript or TypeScript, it's also a personal preference really, because if you feel like you can get a whole lot of good structure with JavaScript, if you feel like you have great control over your code, then why not use JavaScript? Because all TypeScript does really is compile into JavaScript. So as I'm coming from an object-oriented background, I really appreciate TypeScript for its more stricter rules. So JavaScript can be very forgiving sometimes. That is both good and bad, of course. So with TypeScript, I feel like I write more bug-free code really, because I get more error highlights. I have to think a little bit more about what kind of types I want. So I have to annotate our types a little bit more. So what kind of type does this function return? So of course, these types also exist in JavaScript, the primitive types at least. So we of course have our strings and numbers and all of that. But with TypeScript, you can also create, interfaces. So if you have this object, then we can actually specify what kind of properties we want to have on it and what kind of types they are going to be. So if we manage to forget maybe one of these properties, if we forget to add it, then maybe it will be undefined, and maybe that will lead to some kind of undefined behavior really. So with TypeScript, I feel like we get a bit more structure in our code. So I'm gonna select that, but of course feel free to select JavaScript if you feel more comfortable with that. So we're gonna be using npm to install Vite. So we just use npm create Vite at latest, and this is simply just a generator program really to help us select some options. So let's name it. We're gonna be calling it To-Do app. You can call it whatever you like really. So if this is a business, maybe we want to have a more branded name that kind of stands out. But since this is just for ourselves, really, just keep it. Just give it a name that you feel like you will remember. So I'm gonna call it To-Do app. Then we're gonna select a framework. I'm gonna select Svelte here, of course. And then, as we mentioned, I will be selecting TypeScript here. Feel free to select JavaScript if you want to use that instead. And there we go. So this simply scaffolded this project to a new folder, and this just generated some super simple get started code to kind of get up and running quickly. So let's use cd to enter that folder there, and that should be cd on most operating systems and shells. So then we're simply going to be running npm install to install the packages down to our machine. So this simply pulls the code that someone else has written. We have all of these packages that is simply code that someone else has written that we then install down on our machine. And then the next step here is to run the development server. So that is simply the development server that I previously mentioned that auto reflects our changes when we save them. So run npm dev. We can see that it has created and is now listening on this port here. So let's open that up in our browser. And we can see our first Svelte application. Isn't that amazing? So it's just a simple little playground application to show how Svelte is used in a simple counter here that we can click to increment that count there. There's nothing fancy going on here really. So now I've opened that up in my VS Code here, and you can see that it has generated quite a lot of files actually, and some of these we are not going to be interested in keeping. Of course, this is only to get started and get an idea really of what you can do with Svelte, but we're going to remove that. So let's just run that term. I forgot to rerun it there. Yeah, so now we can see that when I remove that is no longer being applied that style sheet here. So this app.css is our global style sheet really. But when it comes to Svelte, we also have isolated CSS, which I will be showing you guys later. But we can see that this is imported from here. So this is kind of interesting. It kind of imports this CSS as a module in our code here. I'm not really sure how this works, but it's definitely interesting that we're importing CSS, kind of like a JavaScript module here. But that is what we do. So we can import our global CSS here. So if we want to change the body here, for example, we do that here. But as I will mention later, we're gonna use isolated CSS for the most part. So these components will all have some isolated CSS. So we also see that it has this main.ts file that we were just in, and this is kind of the main entry point of our Svelte application. This is where we create the Svelte app, and then we import, we import our app.svelte. App.svelte is kind of the main Svelte file. So we see that all of these files that end in Svelte are the Svelte files, and they are the files that contain the Svelte syntax, really. So we can also check in this index.html file, and that is our single page application here. So this is where the app is being mounted really. So in this div ID app, this is our app container really, and that is what we can see here in main.ts. We get this is vanilla JavaScript for getting an element by ID. So this is how it kind of starts. This is how it kind of bootstraps the Svelte application. So if we just look here, we can actually just remove some of this code as well. We can just keep this div class card stuff, and we can also remove that Svelte logo. We don't need that. And we can see that all we're left with is really this great, really dramatic red background and our counter component. So there we go guys, Svelte is now installed and up and running. So this is just a quick installation guide really, and some background information about the project. But in the next video we will actually starting with creating our to-do application. We're not gonna have a counter application anymore. So if you like this video, feel free to like it. If you're not subscribing already, it would be great, since my plan here is to create a community around this where we can actually share code together and learn from each other. It would be amazing. But I'll see you guys next time where we actually start this project. So thank you guys for watching, and peace out.